I was 22 when I took the night custodian job at the Whitefish Research Station in northern Montana. It wasn't my first choice. I'd applied to grad programs that fall and gotten rejection after rejection. So when my uncle mentioned they needed someone to keep the facility running through winter, I said yes without thinking it through. The pay was decent, the work was simple, and I'd have the place mostly to myself. What I didn't consider was what mostly to myself actually meant in the middle of a Montana winter. The station sat 3 miles past the last plowed road, tucked into a valley surrounded by dense pine forest. It was built in the 70s as a forestry research hub, back when the government had money for that sort of thing. By the time I got there, it was just a skeleton crew. 2 researchers who came and went every few weeks, a site manager who lived in town, and me. My job was to keep the pipes from freezing, clear snow from the walkways, make sure the generators stayed running, and lock up every night. Basic maintenance, nothing complicated. The building itself was utilitarian. Concrete foundation, metal siding painted forest green, small windows that rattled when the wind picked up. Inside, it smelled like old coffee and cleaning solution. There was a main lab, a few offices, a break room with a microwave and a dying fridge, and a mechanical room in the back where all the important equipment hummed through the night. The whole structure backed right up to the woods. Not a clearing, not a buffer zone, just a thin strip of gravel and then trees, stretching up the mountain slope like a wall. It was early January when the storm hit, not the first storm of the season, but the worst. The forecast had been calling for heavy snow since Monday, and by Wednesday night it was coming down sideways. Visibility dropped to maybe 10 feet. Wind howled through the valley hard enough to shake the window frames. I was scheduled for the overnight shift, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., which meant I'd be there alone while the storm peaked. The researchers had packed up and left that afternoon.
The site manager called around 10 p.m. to make sure I'd made it in okay. I told him I was fine. I wasn't worried. I'd been through winter storms before. I thought I knew what to expect. The first few hours passed like they always did. I did my rounds, checking thermostats, adjusting space heaters in the offices, making sure the main generator had fuel. The mechanical room was loud, all rattling ducts and groaning machinery, but it was warm. I liked being in there. It felt insulated from the storm. Around midnight, I made coffee in the break room and sat at the desk in the main office, scrolling through my phone. Reception was bad, barely 1 bar, but I could still load pages if I waited long enough. Outside, the storm kept building. Snow piled against the windows in drifts, and every gust of wind sent a low whistle through the vents. At 1:15 a.m., I did my perimeter check. That was part of the routine. Every 2 hours, I was supposed to walk the exterior, make sure snow wasn't blocking the vents, check that the emergency exits were clear, and confirm that nothing had blown loose. I pulled on my insulated coat, gloves, a wool hat, and stepped out the side door into the cold. The wind hit me immediately, sharp and biting. Snow stung my face. The cold sucked the air out of my lungs. I kept my head down and moved quickly, following the gravel path that circled the building. The station's exterior lights were on, but they barely cut through the blowing snow. Everything beyond 10 feet was just white noise. I cleared the first 2 vents without issue, kicking away the drifts that had piled up against the building. The snow was coming down so hard that my tracks disappeared within seconds. By the time I rounded the back corner of the building, my fingers were numb even inside the gloves. That's when I heard the knocking. Not loud, not frantic, just steady. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. It was coming from somewhere near the tree line, maybe 20 feet from the back wall. I stopped and listened, trying to place it. The wind was loud, but the knocking cut through it, rhythmic and deliberate.
My first thought was that a branch had come loose and was hitting something metal, a vent pipe or a gutter, but the rhythm was too clean, too measured. I took a few steps toward the sound, squinting through the snow. The back of the station faced directly into the woods. There was no fence, no barrier, just a narrow strip of gravel and then trees. The knocking continued. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. I pulled out my flashlight and aimed it toward the tree line. The beam barely penetrated the storm, but I could make out the first row of pines, their branches heavy with snow, swaying in the wind. Nothing looked out of place. No broken branches, no loose equipment. I stood there for a moment, listening. The knocking stopped, just like that. No trailing off, no final thump. 1 second it was there. The next it was gone. I waited, scanning the woods with the flashlight. The wind howled. Snow pelted my jacket. My breath came out in clouds. Nothing moved. I told myself it had been a branch, that the wind had shifted and the sound had stopped naturally. I didn't believe it, but I wanted to. I turned back toward the building, and that's when the knocking started again. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. I spun around. It was coming from the same spot, maybe the same tree. I swept the flashlight across the tree line again, slower this time, trying to catch any movement. The beam landed on something dark against the white snow. A shape. I stepped closer, my boots crunching through the snow. The shape was a backpack, half buried in a drift, leaning against the base of a pine tree. It was navy blue, coated in snow, with ice crusted along the zippers. I crouched down and brushed the snow off the top. It was old, worn, the kind of cheap pack you'd get at a discount store. I didn't touch it beyond that. I didn't unzip it. I just stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There was no reason for a backpack to be out here. The station was miles from any trail. The road wasn't plowed past the turnoff. No one hiked up here in winter. The knocking had stopped again. I stood up, flashlight still aimed at the backpack, and looked around. No footprints. The snow around the tree was smooth, except where I disturbed it. Wherever this pack had come from, it hadn't been dropped recently. Or if it had, the storm had already erased the evidence. I backed away from the tree line and headed inside, my heart beating faster than it should have been. I told myself I'd report it in the morning, that it was probably some hiker's gear from last season that had gotten buried and just now surfaced in the storm. But I didn't believe that either. I locked the side door behind me and stood in the hallway for a moment, dripping melted snow onto the floor. The building felt different now, too quiet. I went back to the office and sat down, but I couldn't focus on my phone. I kept looking at the back windows, even though they only showed darkness and swirling snow. At 2:30 a.m., I heard footsteps. Not outside, inside. They were coming from the hallway that led to the lab. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone walking carefully to avoid making noise. My entire body went rigid. I was supposed to be alone. The researchers were gone. The site manager was in town. No one else had access. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor, and listened. The footsteps stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing. I grabbed the flashlight off the desk and moved toward the hallway. The lights were on, the fluorescent panels buzzing faintly overhead, casting everything in cold white light. The hallway was empty. I walked slowly toward the lab, each step echoing off the concrete floor. The lab door was closed, just like I'd left it during my earlier rounds. I pressed my ear against it and listened. Silence. I tried the handle. Locked. I exhaled, feeling stupid, and turned back toward the office. That's when I heard the knocking again. This time, it wasn't outside. It was inside the building. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. It was coming from the mechanical room. I stood frozen in the hallway, flashlight aimed at the mechanical room door at the far end. The knocking continued, steady and rhythmic, cutting through the hum of the machinery.
I forced myself to move, walking toward the door with my pulse hammering in my ears. The mechanical room was always unlocked. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The heat hit me immediately, dry and stifling. The room was packed with equipment. The main generator, backup batteries, water heaters, electrical panels, all of it crammed into a space barely big enough to turn around in. The knocking had stopped. I scanned the room, looking for anything out of place. Everything looked normal. Then I saw the vent. The exterior vent on the back wall, the one that led directly outside. It was open. Not broken, not forced, just open. The metal grate was hanging by one hinge, swinging slightly in the draft. Snow had blown inside, dusting the floor beneath it. I stepped closer to the vent, my boots crunching on the thin layer of snow that had accumulated inside. The vent was at chest height, about 2 feet square, big enough for airflow, but not big enough for a person to fit through. Except the grate was bent. The metal had been warped outward, the edges peeled back like someone had pried it open from the outside. I reached out and touched the metal. It was cold, slick with ice, and sharp where it had been bent. This wasn't storm damage. This was deliberate. I grabbed the grate and tried to pull it closed, but the hinge was broken. It wouldn't stay shut. I stared at the opening, at the darkness beyond it, and felt my stomach turn. Something had tried to get in, or something had gotten in and left. I backed out of the mechanical room and closed the door behind me. My hands were shaking. I pulled out my phone and called the site manager. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I didn't leave a message. I tried again. Voicemail. I stood in the hallway, phone in hand, trying to decide what to do. I could leave. The roads were bad, but my truck had 4-wheel drive. I could make it back to town if I was careful. But if I left, I'd lose the job. And if it turned out to be nothing, if I was overreacting, I'd look like an idiot. I told myself to finish the shift. 6 more hours.
I could do 6 more hours. I went back to the office and sat down, but I didn't turn my back to the hallway. I kept the flashlight on the desk, within reach, and I watched the shadows. At 3:45 a.m., the lights went out. Not flickering, not dimming, just out. The entire building dropped into darkness. The hum of the equipment cut off, replaced by silence so complete it felt like pressure in my ears. I grabbed the flashlight and stood up, my heart slamming against my ribs. The generator was supposed to be automatic. If the main power failed, the backup kicked in within seconds, but nothing was happening. I moved toward the mechanical room, sweeping the flashlight beam across the hallway. The darkness felt thick, almost tangible. I reached the mechanical room door and pushed it open. The generator was off. The panel lights were dark. I checked the fuel gauge, full. I checked the connections. Everything looked fine. I hit the manual start button. Nothing. I tried again. Still nothing. The generator was dead, and I had no idea why. I stood in the dark mechanical room, flashlight clutched in one hand, trying to think. Without power, the heaters would stop working, the pipes would start to freeze within hours, and I'd be stuck here, in the dark, with no heat and no way to call for help. My phone had maybe 20% battery left, and with no reception, it was useless anyway. I left the mechanical room and went back to the office, moving quickly now, the flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. I grabbed my coat and pulled it on. I needed to check the exterior panel, see if something had tripped outside. It was the only thing I could think of. I went to the side door and hesitated, my hand on the handle. I didn't want to go back outside. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay inside, to lock the doors and wait for morning. But I couldn't just sit here in the dark. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the storm. The wind hit me like a fist, nearly knocking me off balance. Snow swirled around me, so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction.
I kept the flashlight aimed at the ground and followed the building's exterior toward the electrical panel on the north side. My breath came in short, harsh gasps. The cold burned my lungs. I reached the panel and yanked open the metal cover. Inside, everything looked fine. No tripped breakers, no blown fuses. I flipped the main breaker off and on again. Nothing happened. I checked every connection, every switch. Everything was in order. The power should have been working. I closed the panel and turned back toward the door. That's when I saw the footprints. They were in the snow, leading away from the side door, heading toward the woods. Fresh prints, not yet filled in by the storm. Human footprints. Boot prints, actually, with a clear tread pattern. They led straight from the door to the tree line and disappeared into the darkness. I stood there, staring at them, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. I hadn't made those prints. I'd come straight from the door to the panel, and I was standing in my own tracks. These prints were different. They were bigger, deeper, like someone heavier had walked through here. I fossiled them with a flashlight, tracing the line from the door to the woods. They didn't waver. They didn't circle back. They just went straight into the trees. I ran back to the side door and yanked it open, stumbling inside and slamming it shut behind me. I locked it, fumbling with the deadbolt, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the metal. I pressed my back against the door and stood there, breathing hard, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. Someone had been inside. Someone had walked out that door and into the woods. Or something. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I just wanted the lights to come back on. I wanted morning to come. I wanted to be anywhere but here. I moved through the building, checking every door, every window. Everything was locked. Everything except the vent in the mechanical room. I went back to the mechanical room and stared at the bent grate. The opening was small, too small for a person. But the footprints outside were real. I'd seen them.
I stood there, trying to make the pieces fit, but they wouldn't. Nothing about this made sense. I left the mechanical room and wedged a chair under the door handle. It wouldn't stop anyone determined, but it made me feel slightly less exposed. I went back to the office and sat down at the desk, flashlight aimed at the hallway. I wasn't going to do any more rounds. I wasn't going near the windows. I was going to sit here until morning, and then I was leaving. At 4:20 a.m., I heard the knocking again.
This time it was at the front door. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. Loud, deliberate, impossible to ignore. I stood up, my legs weak, and moved toward the front entrance. The knocking continued, steady and patient. I reached the door and stood there, staring at it. There was a small window at eye level, reinforced glass with wire mesh. I shined the flashlight through it. Nothing, just snow and darkness. The knocking stopped. I waited, barely breathing. Then I heard it again, but it wasn't at the door anymore. It was at the window to my left. 3 knocks on the glass. I spun toward it, flashlight raised. Nothing. The knocking moved to the next window, then the next. It was circling the building, moving from window to window. Always 3 knocks, always the same rhythm. I backed into the center of the main room, turning slowly, tracking the sound as it moved around the building. It wasn't random, it was methodical. Each window, one after another, working its way around the perimeter. When it reached the back of the building, where the woods pressed closest, it stopped. Silence. I stood there, frozen, waiting for it to start again. It didn't. The silence was worse than the knocking. At least with the knocking, I knew where it was. Now it could be anywhere. I heard a scraping sound, faint and distant, coming from above. From the roof. Something was up there. I could hear it moving, slow and careful, metal groaning under weight. The station had a flat roof with a slight slope for drainage. There was a service ladder on the north side, but I'd never used it. I'd never had a reason to go up there.
The scraping continued, moving from one side of the roof to the other. Then it stopped directly above me. I looked up at the ceiling, at the white acoustic tiles and the fluorescent light fixtures, all dark now, and felt a cold dread settle in my chest. Something was up there, right above me, and it knew where I was. I moved quickly, quietly, away from the center of the room toward the hallway. The scraping followed me. I stopped. It stopped. I took another step. The scraping started again, tracking my movement across the ceiling. It was listening. It was following the sound of my footsteps. I realized in that moment that whatever this was, it was playing with me. It had cut the power. It had circled the building. It had climbed onto the roof, and now it was waiting to see what I would do. I stood perfectly still, barely breathing, and the scraping stopped. I took a slow step backward. Nothing. Another step. Still nothing. But the moment I moved forward, toward the hallway, the scraping started again, matching my pace exactly. I broke into a run, sprinting down the hallway toward the lab. Behind me, above me, the scraping turned into a pounding, something heavy slamming against the roof. I reached the lab door and yanked on the handle. Locked. I'd locked it myself during my earlier rounds. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking, the flashlight tucked under my arm. The pounding on the roof was directly overhead now, right above the hallway. I found the right key and shoved it into the lock. It stuck. I twisted harder, and the lock finally gave. I threw the door open, stumbled inside, and slammed it shut behind me, locking it again from the inside. The lab was small, lined with counters and shelves full of equipment and samples. There were no windows, just 4 walls, a locked door, and me. I stood there, back pressed against the door, listening. The pounding had stopped. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. 10 seconds, 20, 30, nothing. Then I heard it. Footsteps, not on the roof, in the hallway. Slow, heavy footsteps, moving toward the lab door.
I aimed the flashlight at the door, at the narrow gap at the bottom, and saw the shadow. 2 feet, standing just outside. The handle rattled, once, twice, then stopped. I held my breath, praying the lock would hold. The footsteps moved away, back down the hallway, fading into silence. I slid down to the floor, my back still against the door, and tried to think. I was trapped. I couldn't leave the lab without knowing where it was. I couldn't stay here forever. My phone was dead now, the battery drained. The flashlight was dimming. I had maybe an hour of light left, maybe less. I looked around the lab, searching for anything I could use. There was a fire extinguisher mounted on the wall, a metal stool, some glass beakers and chemical bottles. Nothing that would help me against whatever was out there. I sat in the dark, listening, waiting, and realized I'd made a mistake. I'd trapped myself. I don't know how long I sat there. Time felt strange in the dark, stretched out and compressed at the same time. Eventually, the silence became unbearable. I stood up, legs stiff and aching, and pressed my ear against the door. Nothing. No footsteps, no scraping, no knocking, just the faint howl of the wind outside. I unlocked the door, slowly, and eased it open an inch. The hallway was empty. I opened the door wider and stepped out, flashlight raised. The beam was weak now,
barely cutting through the darkness. I moved down the hallway toward the office, every nerve on edge, ready to run at the first sound. The office was exactly as I'd left it. Chair by the desk, coat draped over the back, nothing disturbed. I checked the side door, still locked. I checked the front door, locked. I checked every window, all secure. Whatever had been here, it was gone now, or it was hiding. I went back to the mechanical room, the chair still wedged under the door handle. I pulled it aside and stepped inside. The vent was still open, snow still dusting the floor beneath it. I stared at it for a long moment, then made a decision. I needed to see what was outside that vent. I needed to know.
I grabbed the metal stool from the lab and dragged it into the mechanical room. I climbed onto it and shined the flashlight through the vent opening. The beam illuminated a narrow section of the exterior wall and the edge of the tree line beyond. Snow swirled in the light. I leaned closer, angling the flashlight downward, and saw them. Scratches. Deep, gouging scratches in the metal siding below the vent, like something had clawed its way up the wall. The marks were fresh, the exposed metal still bright. I pulled back, my stomach turning. And that's when I saw the hand. It shot through the vent opening, pale and wet, fingers splayed, reaching for me. I fell backward off the stool, hitting the floor hard, the flashlight skittering across the concrete. The hand withdrew as quickly as it had appeared. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed the flashlight, and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the front entrance. I unlocked the door and threw it open, and the storm hit me with full force. Snow and wind and cold, so cold it felt like knives. I didn't care. I ran toward the parking area, my truck barely visible through the storm. I fumbled for my keys, dropped them in the snow, found them again. My hands were numb. I couldn't feel my fingers. I got the door open and climbed inside, slamming it shut behind me. I locked the doors and sat there, shaking, staring at the dark shape of the station through the windshield. I turned the key. The engine turned over once, twice, then died. I tried again. Nothing. I checked the fuel gauge. Half a tank. I tried the ignition again. The engine didn't even turn over this time. It was dead, just like the generator, just like everything else in this place. I looked at the station, at the dark windows and the open front door, and realized I'd left it open. I'd run out without closing it, and now I could see something moving inside. A shape, tall and thin, standing in the doorway, watching me. I couldn't stay in the truck. If it came for me, I'd be trapped. I needed to move, to get away from the building, away from the woods. I pushed the door open and stumbled out into the storm.
The road was somewhere ahead, buried under feet of snow, but it was my only option. I started walking, then jogging, then running, the cold burning my lungs with every breath. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if it was following me. I just ran, my boots sinking into the snow with every step, the wind screaming in my ears. I don't know how far I made it before I fell. My foot caught on something buried beneath the snow, and I went down hard, face first into the drift. I tried to push myself up, but my arms wouldn't work. My hands were too cold. I rolled onto my back and stared up at the sky, at the swirling snow and the darkness, and knew I wasn't going to make it. I heard the engine before I saw the lights, a deep rumble, cutting through the storm, growing louder. Headlights appeared through the snow, two bright beams cutting through the darkness. A truck, moving slowly, carefully, following the buried road. I tried to yell, but my voice came out as a croak. I waved my arm, barely able to lift it. The truck slowed, then stopped. A door opened. Someone shouted. I couldn't make out the words. Hands grabbed me, pulled me up, dragged me toward the truck. I was shoved into the passenger seat, heat blasting from the vents, and the door slammed shut. The driver was the site manager. He was yelling something, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't answer. I just stared through the windshield at the station, at the dark shape still standing in the doorway. He followed my gaze, squinting through the snow. "What is that?" he asked. I didn't answer. He put the truck in reverse and backed away from the station, turning around slowly, carefully. The shape didn't move. It just stood there, watching us leave. The site manager drove us back toward town, the truck crawling through the snow, and I sat in silence, shaking from more than just the cold. He asked me what happened. I told him the power went out. I told him I tried to fix it. I told him the generator was dead and my truck wouldn't start. I didn't tell him about the knocking. I didn't tell him about the footprints or the hand. I didn't tell him what I saw in the doorway.
I knew he wouldn't believe me. We made it to town just after 6 a.m. The sun was starting to rise, pale and weak through the storm. He dropped me off at the motel where I'd been staying and told me to get some rest. He said he'd go back to the station later, once the storm cleared, to check on the equipment. I nodded and climbed out of the truck. I went inside, locked the door, and sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing my coat and boots. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I just sat there, staring at the wall, replaying everything in my head. The site manager called me 2 days later. The storm had passed, and he'd been out to the station. Everything was fine, he said. The generator was working, the power was on. There was no damage to the building, no sign of forced entry. He asked me if I checked the main breaker properly. I told him I had. He didn't push it. He said they decided to close the station for the rest of the winter, that it wasn't worth the risk after what happened. He paid me for the full month and told me I didn't need to come back. I thanked him and hung up. I didn't tell him I'd already decided I wasn't going back. I didn't tell him that I'd spent the last 2 days sitting in the motel room, jumping at every sound, unable to shake the feeling that something had followed me back. I didn't tell him that I kept seeing that pale hand in my mind, reaching through the vent, fingers splayed. I left Montana a week later. I packed everything I owned into my truck, which started fine now, no issues, and drove south. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to be somewhere else, somewhere warm, somewhere far from the woods and the snow and the silence. I found work in Arizona, doing maintenance at a community college. The weather was hot, dry, the complete opposite of Montana. I liked it. I liked the sun and the open sky and the fact that nothing grew tall enough to loom over me. But even there, even in the desert, I couldn't shake what happened. I'd lie awake at night, listening to the building settle and hear 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. It was never real. It was always the wind or the AC or my imagination, but it was always there.
Years later, I looked up the Whitefish research station online. I don't know why. Maybe I needed to prove to myself that it was real, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. I found an article from a local Montana news site dated 3 years before I worked there. A researcher had gone missing during a winter storm. She'd been working late, alone, and when her colleagues came back the next morning, she was gone. They found her backpack in the woods, half buried in snow, but no sign of her. The search was called off after 2 weeks. The article included a photo of the backpack, navy blue, worn, cheap, the same one I'd found by the tree line. I clicked through more articles, digging deeper. There were other incidents. A hiker in the 70s who disappeared near the valley, a forestry worker in the 80s who'd reported hearing knocking sounds in the woods before vanishing, local rumors of something that lived in the mountains, something that came out during storms. The kind of stories people tell around campfires, half joking, not really believing. But I believed. I knew what I'd seen. I knew what had been on that roof, in that hallway, reaching through the vent. I just didn't have a name for it. I thought about calling the site manager, telling him what I'd found, but I didn't. What would I say? That the station was built on cursed ground, that something in those woods was waiting for the next person to be alone in a storm? He wouldn't believe me. No one would. So I kept it to myself. I stopped looking up articles. I stopped thinking about Montana. I tried to move on, but every winter, when the temperature drops and the sky turns gray, I feel it, that same cold dread sitting heavy in my chest. And I know, somewhere, it's still out there, still knocking, still waiting. I'm 31 now. It's been 9 years since that night. I've built a life far away from mountains and forests and winter storms. I have a decent job, a small apartment, routines that keep me grounded. Most days I don't think about what happened. Most days I'm fine. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and I'm alone, I hear it. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks.
And I have to remind myself that it's not real, that it's just my mind playing tricks, that I'm safe. But part of me, the part that stood in that dark building and saw that hand reach through the vent, knows better. It knows that some things don't stay in the past. Some things follow you. And no matter how far you run, no matter how much distance you put between yourself and that moment, it's always there, waiting in the silence, ready to start knocking again.